Hey React fans, we have some massive news for you. React Universe Conf 2024 is happening on September 5th and 6th in Wrocław, Poland. Formerly known as React Native EU, we're expanding our horizons to include all things React and React Native. Why should you join us? Meet your tech heroes and open source contributors, learn from 20 plus speakers from Meta, Expo, Shopify, Infinite Red, Callstack, and many more. Be the first to discover exclusive tech reveals, get instantly applicable tips on full stack and cross-platform development, and network to fuel your career. Plus, experience the community spirit and attend a fantastic networking party on day 1 and after party on day 2. Tickets are limited, so hurry up and book yours at reactuniverse.com. You can also buy a combo ticket to attend both the conference and expert-led workshops. Let's dive into today's episode.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the React Native Show podcast, brought to you by Callstack, a total software engineering consultancy. I'm your host, malicious. I'm here today with Peter Fernandez, and this is the second part of our podcast on security about authentication and authorization. If you haven't seen the first part or on authentication, I highly recommend. We'll probably be referencing that a lot. So, but we're here to talk about authorization. So like the second part of this topic. Let me go back to the motto on the Okta website. Secure access for everyone, but not just anyone. So this is like the second part, not just anyone. We don't want to let just anyone in. And I'm joined here by Peter Fernandez, Principal Developer Advocate at Auth0.
That's right.
That's right. Yeah, I got it right. Awesome. Okay. So let's dive right in. We feel that we know what authentication is, what authorization is, and I know you mentioned already, and I want to dive into the difference between the delegated authorization and access control. So let's start with those two because it feels like these are very important terms that may be over the heads of many listeners.
Yeah, it's a great place to start. And thank you very much as well for the introduction. So in the previous podcast, we talked all about authentication, and that's important because in any authorization model, and we talked about two things there, two distinct aspects of authorization, but in any authorization model, you need authentication, because if I can't tell that the user is who they say they are, I don't know what authorization mechanisms to apply. So in terms of authorization, you mentioned a couple of things there. You mentioned access control, and you mentioned delegated authorization. Let's take access control first.
Let's start with it.
Because for many years, that was all authorization essentially was. And I say all it was because that's a big enough field by itself. But that was essentially what authorization meant. Access control is all about essentially, if I want to do something, am I actually allowed to do it? Does policy or kind of configuration or definitions say that if I want to go and withdraw 100 euros from my bank account, can I go and draw 100 euros from my bank account? Or if you're in the UK,
Let's wrap a quick bow around the difference between authentication and authorization here, because this is like a good example that you want to withdraw 100 quid. I love that word.
In the UK, £100. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, £100 from your bank. But first, if you want to do that, first the bank needs to know who you are. So that's authentication. You already got authenticated. The bank knows that you are who you say you are, and now you want to get your £100. So the bank needs to know if you can take that money out of that account.
And it might be that I don't have £100 in my account. So there's an access control mechanism that comes into play that says, yeah, you don't actually have £100 in your account. Or I might have gone over my limit for the day, for example, and I can't take any more money out because I previously had taken, let's say, £500 or however much it is out of my account. Or there might be some block on my account which stops me from actually taking out that money, even though I am who I say I am. So That's all about authorization. That's all about access control, that part of it. Now, sticking with the banking application, because it works really well. The application itself has made a request on my behalf, and that request says that person wants to take out £100 from their account. Now, assuming that I am authorized to do that, I have access control to do that, and access control allows me to go take that money out. Delegated authorization is where I say, I'm actually going to allow you, the application, to make that request on my behalf. And delegated authorization came into play when we effectively had OAuth 2 come on the scene. And OAuth 2 is all about securing, well, it's all about accessing APIs in a secured way. So application programming interfaces, essentially public-facing APIs, which are HTTP endpoints through which I can make requests to do things. And typically an application will make a request to do something or get some information on behalf of the person using that application, on behalf of me as a user. So delegated authorization actually, from an API perspective, it completes this circle. The application, the back end of the application itself, what in OAuth 2 terms, OAuth 2 terms, you try saying that, it's like difficult. OAuth, yeah, I don't know why I strung those two words together. OAuth 2 terms is essentially known as a resource server, where the resource server, the thing that's running on the back end, the API, essentially will allow me to do something, right? So, and based on my access, computed via my identity and the authentication piece, actually allow the application to do something. But the delegated piece actually completes the circle. It gives me the ability to allow or give consent for an application to do something on my behalf. And that's really important. That's really important in a modern security environment where I should have control over my information as much as I'm controlled in what I actually do.
So these are not access control and delegated
authorization.
Delegated authorization. Thank you. So these are not like mere terms. There are libraries and SDKs and APIs and protocols that govern and orchestrate this scenario as using applications.
Correct.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so in the industry standard protocol, OAuth 2, a service that actually participates in this delegated authorization process is known as an authorization server. And the authorization server's job actually is to mint tokens that an application can give to an API, where that it's like the Royal Mint, right? Okay, it's like, you know, the Royal Mint. It's just the thing in the UK. The Royal Mint basically issues money. Well, these authorization servers will issue tokens, and they're intended for the API, and they're intended for the API's use. And the application, they pass through the application because the application holds on to them, and when it's calling an API, will gives them to the API, and the API validates the request. But they're not intended for the application, but they are part. All those things are part of an industry standard protocol, and that protocol is called OAuth 2. And Auth 0, as well as being an authentication server, what's known as an IDP, an identity provider, or an open provider in OpenID Connect terms, as well as being that from an authentication perspective, Auth 0 is a authorization server as well. So it kind of marries the two things together to give you a holistic solution. effectively.
And
for when
to
you're
confuse
building
you
applications.
more as to which part does.
Oh yeah,
what.
definitely. No, well, actually, here's the thing that is the most confusing. And in the previous episode, I mentioned that terms in the industry, in the IT industry, get overused all the time. And one of the terms that gets overused all the time in the industry is the term JWT, JSON Web Token. And JSON Web Tokens are these kind of like tokens. They're blobs of data that can be signed. So you know that they haven't been tampered with. They have a signature associated with them. And in the specification for OAuth 2, it says that an authorization server will mint a token, right? And the token is given to the application passes it to the API. Now, that token in the specification doesn't say what format it should be in. And here's where sometimes it gets a little bit confusing, because Auth0 handles and mints tokens as an authorization server in JWT format as well. And in OpenID Connect, which is the protocol for authentication, which is part of, well, the service that Auth0 supports, the specification by default says that the token that is minted is in JWT format. So now, when I talk about JWT format tokens, which one am I talking about, right? And so that's where the confusion can sometimes come in. Both an access token and an ID token are both in JWT format, but an access token is designed to be consumed by an API, where an ID token is designed to be consumed by an application. And sometimes that's what gets a bit confusing when you come to play around with Auth0. But there is a reason. There is a reason why we do it.
I was going to ask you, is there like a clear advantage to using JWT?
Yeah. Absolutely. What it means is that token is self-contained. You can put whatever you like in it. Typically, you want to keep it as small as possible, but you can put whatever you like in it. And the API does not need to go back to the authorization server for what's called introspection. It does not need to actually make another network call to actually figure out what's in that token and whether or not that token is valid. It can do it all by itself in a self-contained fashion. That improves performance, but it also means that those tokens potentially can be used in situations where you're not always connected to a network. And that opens up a lot of opportunity for a lot of advantageous scenarios.
Offline first applications and stuff like that.
Yeah, as long as they go online at some point. But actually, offline resource servers sometimes, and there are some scenarios. I work a lot in theatre, either on stage or backstage or directing or whatever. And sometimes you get resource servers that operate in theatres. They control lighting and stuff like that. And sometimes they're air-gapped. They only are connected to a network whilst the show is not running, for example. And in those scenarios, those lighting systems can actually make calls to a offline resource server and have that resource server validate something that it doesn't need to go and do token introspection on. So it's kind of a really advantageous scenario or an advantageous solution in that particular scenario.
Interesting. I didn't know there was so much tech involved in lighting theater.
Oh, it used to be. In the old days, it's another hidden walk down memory lane, right? We did this in the previous episode. But in the old days, right, everything used to be connected via XLR cabling. And today, most of the stuff still is, but IP networks got introduced, and wireless lighting and wireless mics and wireless sound and stuff like that. A theatre is probably one of the most hostile environments when it comes to RF So radio frequencies, there's radio signals going all over the place. It tends to cause havoc and chaos with anything. But as technology has matured,
yeah, you have so many actors with the mics and the lights.
Radio mics and lights generate a huge amount of EMF. Like the old tungsten lamps create a lot of EMF, electromotive force, which essentially sends off disruptive radio signals. And like in the old days, you wouldn't put anything high tech in a theater and expect it to work. But these days, folks build in the industry. It's a massive industry, and folks build some really robust equipment that just runs on IP networks and wirelessly and stuff like that. And it's you see it more and more in theaters, especially with LED lamps that are used today in theaters and stuff like that. But anyway, I digress. This is me kind of going off down on the tangent.
You being a software engineer, when you work in theater, do you get called like by your friends and say he's the IT guy, he's going to fix everything?
Yes, and I also when I direct shows, I also sometimes get very creative, and I did a production of Nick Payne's Constellations, which is a great show. If you've never seen it, go look it up somewhere, and if it's on, go watch it. It's a brilliant show. It's all about the choices that you never made and what would happen. It's kind of multiverse type stuff, but it's really cool. And I built a whole lighting rig especially for this. I kind of had the notion to do it. I got to 2 months before we actually started rehearsal, and I went, I don't actually know how to do this. So I spent a lot of Googling and building and stuff like that. And yeah, I put my soldering skills to good use. So there we go.
That's good. That's good. Always learning new skills. That's good. That's good. So let's jump back into authorization, back from theater to authorization, and let's talk about authorization. I was wondering, since authentication, we know that for the end user, authentication is the first step, and then authorization. How about from the developer perspective? When you choose your authentication, how does that impact what you can use for authorization? Is it linked at all or not?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. And the answer, I suppose, the simple answer, I suppose, is no, it's not. Yes, you need an authenticated user context, but how you get that authenticated user context is, well, something of a moot point. You could build authentication yourself. In the last episode, we told you not to build authentication. So why you don't want to do that? But once you've got an authenticated user context, then essentially authorization comes into its own right. And let's just talk about access control in that context to start with. So access control comes in various different models. You'll kind of hear a lot about something called RBAC, role-based access control. And then you'll hear maybe something about ABAC, which is attribute-based access control. So role-based access control is all about what you can do based on your role. And let's take a classic example. I'm like a principal developer advocate, so I can do certain things as a principal developer advocate. I'm not a manager, so I can't do certain things that a manager would be able to do. And I'm not the CEO, so I can't do things that the CEO would be able to do. So that's my role. In whatever it happens to be, whether it's a organization or it happens to be whatever your software does, the role that you're playing as the user is basically coming into play from a role-based access control perspective. Attribute-based access control is essentially, well, based upon kind of like attributes associated with the access. So maybe the time of day or the location you're trying to access something from, whether you're coming in remotely or you're coming in from an office location. And that's attribute-based access control. And you can use both models together, right? But they're not exclusive. Certain models have certain capabilities that are valuable, and you can augment those with other models. A new kid on the block, we use that term quite a lot in the previous episode, but a new kid on the block is called RBAC, relationship-based access control. And relationship-based access control is all about, well, relationships that folks have to think. So my role as a principal developer advocate might allow me to do X and Y and Z, but if I'm also working maybe as part of another team at Okta, then, or working on behalf of another team at Okta, then I've got certain attributes associated with that being part of that team, and my relationship with that team maybe enables other features and functions that I am allowed to do based upon that relationship, right? And relationship-based access control is something that was really kind of developed by Google. If you've ever come across something called Google Zanzibar, Zanzibar is effectively the access control engine and the relationship-based access control engine that effectively sits behind all of the things in essentially Google Workspace, so Docs and Google Office and all those sort of things, or whatever they call it these days. So when I do sharing and stuff like that, it's relationship-based access control that's coming into play. And there's access control is, I suppose, access control from that perspective in authorization is probably where authentication was maybe a decade ago, maybe less than that. In that, typically folks have been building that as something within their application. They've been building it themselves. And today there are lots of vendors, including ourselves, that provide it as a service. So Auth0 out of the box provides you with RBAC capability. And we have something else as well called fine-grained authorization, which provides folks with, well, relationship-based access control in the same way that effectively we provide authentication with Auth0. And relationship-based access control is quite interesting because you can model quite a lot of the other access control mechanisms using relationship-based access control.
Okay, so from your point of view, authentication is something that's developed, that evolved more so far. Like the authorization is like a newer part of this flow. Like maybe less evolved, and maybe the world is changing a little bit with it.
I think it's not that it's less evolved. It's that now more vendors are looking at providing authorization as a service. So we had quite Auth0 and other folks were looking at doing authentication as a service. Now we have a way as well of offloading a lot of that complexity from developers and providing authorization as a service. So that's the bit I think that's evolved and is much more kind of forefront in the landscape, I presume.
There are, for sure, there are new cases for authorization that come up. As I mentioned before, I have 2 kids, so we have tried Family Link on their phones, and that's something like the kid is authenticated on their phone, but they're not authorized to do this or that. So that's something that has been developed in the last, I don't know, a couple of years, maybe a little bit more, but that's like a new way that we see getting authorized to do stuff outside of work.
Yeah. And that's a really good example of how authorization probably has been the province of, well, kind of workspaces and workforce for many years, but is now really kind of coming into its own within consumer environments. So we talked about this in a previous episode, but you have like B2C applications, which are essentially building an application directly to a consumer. Business to consumer is what B2C stands for. And it's where folks like you and I will use the application directly. And then you have B2B applications, which is essentially where you're building an application for another business to use. They typically will deploy it in their IT infrastructure, and their employees and contractors and everything else will use that application. And that kind of level of access control, what often, the word that often gets associated with access control is policy. There's policy defined, which tells the system what access somebody has. And that level of policy essentially was, for many years, just the province of, when you did things at work. But there's a really good example where you set up a policy now for your kids. And whilst they can use the phone, you've set up a policy where they can't do certain things.
Yes, for sure. As far as workplace environment is concerned, me being a software engineer in React Native and React, I started off as a front-end engineer. So authorization wasn't ever really my topic, since it's much more on the back end, API, servers, stuff like that's what comes to mind when I think of authorization. But I would like to get your thoughts on how the front end has evolved. We have huge applications like you can run Microsoft Teams in your web browser, or Jira, stuff like that. So now front-end developers should start learning more about authorization, right?
So that's a really interesting question, and a really interesting area as well. And it fits really between security and user experience. It's always a tightrope that you walk, right? It's this line that you walk between user experience and essentially security. From a security perspective, the front end is never secure. That's a statement that you can almost use ubiquitously, and you kind of can argue. I mean, I can argue against that statement and say, well, I've got my mobile phone. Like, that's got a secure keychain on it. And like, I can store things in that key. Passkeys, for example, get stored in that keychain, right? And it's secure. But the idea of something that is front end is essentially that it's typically in the wild. Like, I've got my phone here, it's with me, and essentially I could spend hours, weeks, months, or years trying to hack that device. Doesn't matter how complicated the technology is, I have that device and I can hack it. A back-end server system, I never get to physically interact with it. I only ever get to interact with it over a web browser, a front end, or via an API. But I never essentially get to access that hardware. I can't take it apart. I can't essentially put debuggers on it. I can't put in-circuit emulators on it, all of that sort of stuff, right? So authorization from a security perspective always has to be the province of the back end. But, and here's the but, authorization has a place, especially access control has a place in the front end, because, well, I don't know about you, but I don't really like the user experience where, like, the front end pops up some dialogue. I type a lot of stuff into it. I hit OK, and suddenly it says, "Oh no, you're not allowed to do that," because it's gone and talked to the back end, and the back end has said, "No, you can't. What are you trying to do? You can't do that." So the authorization, the access control models, have a valuable place in the front end to be able to inform the UX. Now, irrespective of whether I bypass the UX, whether I hack into the code of the front end because I've got access to the device and essentially bypass all of those security controls, I'm not using security from an access control perspective at the front end. I'm doing that at the back end. What I'm doing at the front end is using access control to inform what the user should typically see. And that makes the user experience so much nicer. I can gray out dialogues that I'm not allowed to have access to, hide them all together, gray out buttons, disable functionality that I don't have as part of either the role I play or the access control that's been defined for me.
Yeah, that's that's such a great answer. I was thinking a little bit more about those the UI that's we have to consider that's something that's out there in the wild and just has to be considered as something that's accessible to everyone. But should when there's a cooperation between the backend developers and the front-end developers, how much of a cooperation there should be? How much the front-end developers should get into the weeds of what can be accessed, of what shouldn't be accessed, and the protocol. Should we really try and learn all that stuff to make it work, or should we just rely on the fact that it's out of our hands, and we focus on the UI, and we let the backend developer do their work and just tell us, show this? Or should we try and work our way? Maybe I'm sort of answering my own question, but there are full stack developers. What do you think about full stack developers?
Oh, and that puts me squarely in that category. And as a full stack developer, I don't know if there's any other full stack developer. I'm sure there must be, right, out there that do this.
At least 2 or 3 of you out there.
There must be, right? Okay, so there's but you do this, right? I'll be working. So I've got several computers set up, and you see some of the screens over here, right? And connected to the cloud, I have remote desktops to virtual servers that are running and stuff like that. So I'll switch to one server, and I'll write maybe an API function on the back end, and then I'll make a call to that API from the front end. And I'll literally sit there and go, now it would be good if I could get this information from the API. And I'll literally go, I wonder what that would look like from a front end perspective. And I'll talk to myself, right, as 2 different personas, right?
Okay.
The back end developer and the front end developer. And that's one of the beauties, I think, if you're a full stack developer, is that you essentially get to converse in your own head with yourself. And language can sometimes be a real barrier to things, but if you can think it and you can just talk to yourself internally and sometimes externalize that internal monologue, it becomes so much easier, right? So I think if we look at that from a contract perspective, I think that means what I think that boils down to is that it is important for back-end developers and front-end developers to talk to each other. But it's important to know what the responsibilities are as well. Back-end developers should always be responsible for implementing the access control and determining the granularity at which they implement that as well. So you'll hear the term, in fact, we use the term for the kind of relationship-based access control product that we have, fine-grained authorization. That's the term, right? We actually use it as a product name. But fine-grained authorization means that you're doing access control at a level which is as close as possible to the resource. That means that you have control over the minutiae of the information that you want to access. That's solely the province of the back-end developer. And it really needs the back-end developer to know what that resource is, what that resource access might be like, and essentially how resources maybe interact with one another, right? From a front-end perspective, what I don't necessarily need to know all of those details and the minutiae and the kind of granularity of access control. What I need really from a back-end perspective is enough information that tells me what I should be displaying to the user from a front-end perspective and what I should be hiding from the user, really, to make the user's life easier. And so when I'm kind of coding and writing something that is essentially full stack, I get to do all that dialogue in my head. And I get to really do away with some of the obscurity of language and the translation problems and things like that. And I don't just mean translation from one language to another. I literally mean I could be talking English to somebody and the two of us come from a completely different perspective and we still don't understand what each other say. And that's why it's important, I think. I don't think it's necessary for a front-end developer to know all of the minutiae, but they need to know enough to be able to communicate to the backend developer that it's important from a user perspective to either show something in the UI, hide it, and then let the backend developer essentially do the access control, make those access control checks, and either reject something or allow it. Because guess what? It doesn't matter whether you have a front end. If you have got a distributed application where you have an API, you can make API calls without the front end. So you can bypass the front end completely. So that's why access control needs to be implemented down at the back end. And that kind of process of reject something or allow it needs to actually be done at the back end. But the front end developer needs to know enough and be able to get enough information to make the UX really a pleasurable experience.
So the key takeaway is that even if the front-end developer doesn't need to have like the full grasp of how the backend is orchestrated, they should at least have like a basic understanding to be able to understand each other with the backend developer and to talk about it. In the realm of React Native, we're sort of stepping on the toes of full stack developers sometimes because applications can store stuff in local storage. Well, local storage is on web as well, but like on the storage on the phone. So that's kind of the responsibility of the React Native developer. And so we're kind of like peeking behind the curtain a little bit, trying to understand and find our way in the new waters there.
And here's a really good example of that, right? Is that sometimes there's an absolute requirement for what something that's a secure or security related artifact to be stored on the front end. And to be stored securely in native storage, like the keychain or on an iPhone, for example, right? So, case in point is the access token itself. I go to an authorization server, it mints me an access token to call my API. I'm going to store that access token somewhere because I'm not going to consume it as the application, but I need to pass it to the API when I make the API call. So, there's still an awareness from a security perspective that a front-end developer has to have when we're talking about storing security artifacts. And those security artifacts are things like tokens, things like access tokens, need to be stored in a safe place.
JWT tokens.
Sorry?
JWT tokens.
Those JWTs, yeah, those who? JW who? Yeah. Those JWTs that basically get stored away, yeah, they need to be stored somewhere secure. So from a storage perspective, from the security landscape, it's important that the front-end developer knows how to securely store something. Access tokens are great, especially JWTs, because they can be limited in their lifetime. So they can only be valid for a certain lifetime and then they effectively expire. So you have some control over essentially how much of a threat there is in the landscape on the front end when you're storing security artifacts. But yes, as a front end developer, security artifacts that are used to access APIs, used to access back-end services, the security of those is important.
We met before once before doing this podcast, and you mentioned something that caught my attention: the principle of least privilege. And I think that's something that's important. And let's talk about it. What is that?
It's something that I always have to Google because I forget.
Okay.
Actually, sometimes I have to Google it because of it. So the principle of I forget the term more than what it actually means.
Is there an acronym? Because it's like PLP.
No, but it's some people call it the principle of privilege. There's the principle of least privilege. There's the least privilege principle, and so like it depends. They're all the same thing essentially, but the principle of least privilege says this: just have enough to do what you need to do and nothing more. That's really what it boils down to at the end of the day. So I'll give you an example. If I'm going going to create an access token, for example, access tokens are part of the OAuth 2 specification, have something called scope associated with them. The scope of operation is literally what I have consented for an application to do on my behalf. Now, if I ask as the application for more scope than I need, then essentially I am, as a user, giving more privilege to the application than it needs to do the thing it needs to do. Now, if somebody was to steal that access token, if that access token was to get leaked in some way, if that access token was to get out in the wild, now whoever's got that access token, while that access token is still valid, while its lifetime is still such that it hasn't expired, that access token could be used to do something that was never intended that the application needed to do. But just because the application asks for more privilege, now that access token opens up a threat landscape that's much wider. So the principle of least privilege is pretty simple. It is just ask for what you need to do in order to do what you need to do. That's it.
That's it. Okay. So how scared should the end users be, like in layman's terms, when you log into an app and it shows you dialog box that it wants to access like all your information on Facebook and I know your messages in your phone? How scared should we be? Super scared.
Be judicious. Be judicious. Like there's lots of examples actually in Facebook of Facebook apps effectively in that very way stealing privilege and gaining access to things that they really shouldn't have access to. So it's like anything security related. You could spend your entire life like losing sleep over everything. And you could just go, if I'm sensible about this, then I'll be okay. And there are corner cases to that, don't get me wrong. But I, for example, do most of my banking on my mobile phone simply because I think it's probably the most secure environment. It's certainly more secure than me walking into a branch and maybe people overhearing like account details and stuff like that. But I think I've got to temper that with the convenience that my mobile phone banking gives me with the level of security I'm confident with. And if somebody sends me an email saying, log in here and effectively enter your credentials, I will typically go, does that come from a place that I know is secure and safe? Or is that somebody trying to phish me? Is that somebody trying to get access to my information by making me do something that I really shouldn't be doing? So I think in answer to that question, it's be judicious. Just be aware. Keep your wits about you. It's an old English phrase from back in Dickens' day or something like that, which just basically means, just keep aware of your surroundings.
You said be aware, so that made me think of Jean-Claude Van Damme because he was aware.
Yeah, he was. Funny how he makes these connections. It's cool.
You mentioned how sometimes tokens can be stolen, and so there are these threats in the world. And in the context of that, I was wondering what it's like working for Okta, for Auth0, for the authentication solution provider, because it seems to me that when somebody finds a bug in Auth0 or maybe in Okta, I was reading actually an article the other day about a bug in one of Okta's products, but it was like a very serious, it was seriously written. They said there was disclosure to Okta and the bug was fixed, and only after that they wrote the article. So it was all nicely done. But my question actually is it stressful? Because for me, like a metaphor I had in my head is that you were at a party, everybody's drunk, and they gave you their car keys, and you have to like keep it all together. And they all try to take the keys. I don't know. So is it
like what? Sometimes it feels like you're walking around with a big target painted on your back. It's like,
it does.
shoot here. Yeah. Well, here's the thing. And it's really interesting, this. It does not matter what you do, right? It doesn't matter at the end of the day what you do. Folks over the years have tried to build door locks that are unpickable and safes that are uncrackable and car systems that can't be hacked into. You'll always find someone who's clever, and you'll always find someone who's just got the tenacity to break something. Now, if you are a developer and essentially you are trying to protect against that as well as develop something, right, you've got a lot of your work cut out for you. If you're a security company, well, they might sometimes have a big target painted on your back. But if you're a security company with a pedigree, that is a number of years where you've seen a lot of this stuff, and stuff gets harder and harder to hack and crack you and make you, kind of go a bit wobbly around the edges, then you've got a security provider whose job it is to invest time, money, and effort to essentially analyze and protect against the threat landscape. And that means that, well, if I'm building an application where I want essentially the best security I can get, I want somebody who's actually been through it and actually experienced a lot of this stuff that otherwise I wouldn't even have a clue where it was going to come from. So although we sometimes have a big target painted on our backs, it's actually nice sometimes to have a big target painted on the back, because it means that we're actually doing something right. It means that we're doing our job right. It means that people are targeting us. And the more data you have on something, the easier it is to analyze and protect against it. And the more people that try and hack our systems, the more people that come in and try and force our way through our security, the better chance we have of building systems that not only are secure for us at Okta, but are secure for everybody else who integrates with us as well. So, yeah, it's a double-edged sword.
It's a double-edged sword, for sure. So is the threat, like the feeling of having the target on your back, is that like a sort of like a constant hum in your head? It's always there, or is it like that you have weeks or days where, oh my gosh, we just had like a threat actor that really hit us hard, and we're gonna work hard over the weekend, I don't know, something like that? Or is it just like a steady flow of attacks?
It essentially, for me, in my position, what it does is makes me aware of the advice and the best practice guidance that I give developers, right? Because sometimes, no matter how well you build your system, it doesn't matter if you have the best door lock on your house. If you forget to lock the door, right, the security is completely useless. So it makes me aware of the fact that I should give the best practice guidance and advice wherever I possibly can. It also makes me aware that I need to be up on what the product does and the capabilities and stuff like that, so I can communicate that well to customers. Do I lose sleep over it? Am I in a position within the organization where I go, actually, I've got to go and deal with the press now on this one? That's why our CEO gets paid a lot of money. And, he does that. But all kudos to Todd. He does a fantastic job at it. And he gets a lot of negative press, and he gets a lot of criticism, really. But he does a brilliant job essentially handling what is an inevitable part of being in our industry. And I feel safer like integrating with the product in the applications I build because of the things that we actually end up going through.
Awesome. That's a really great message. It's really awesome talking with you, but I think we should try and wrap this up a little bit. Today we've been talking about authorization. And for me personally, the biggest takeaway is, even if it's not 100% the front-end developers' work to know everything, we should learn our basics, know our acronyms, and ACAB and ABAC and AirBAC. And REBAC. Let's
REBAC. Don't forget REBAC.
REBAC is that's the new one. Let's learn about that. And let's educate ourselves and see what's out there. There are many solutions provided by Okta, many others as well, but Okta has great solutions for authorization, right?
We do.
Yeah, there you go.
You heard it from another great English expression from the horse's mouth.
From the horse's mouth. There, exactly. So thank you so much, Peter, for being here. It was a great pleasure to do this inaugural hosting with you. You've been a great guest, and thank you so much for answering all the questions.
Well, thank you very much for having me. You have been a fantastic host, even though it's your inaugural outing. Well, second outing, because we did your inaugural outing in our previous podcast, but you wouldn't know it. You've done a fantastic job. Thank you very much for making me feel comfortable at home and giving me the opportunity to talk to all your listeners.
Great. And thank you, our listeners. Thank you very much. There is going to be a survey in the description of this video. So let us know what you thought about everything that we talked about here today. And maybe let us know if for you app security is an afterthought or maybe top priority. We want to know. And thank you for tuning in.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Before we sign off, an exciting update. The React Native Show is relaunching as React Universe on air. Shortly, we're not parting ways with React Native. Instead, we are expanding to cover every angle of cross-platform and full-stack development, from React Native to React. The content quality remains stellar, with conversations with leading tech creators and thought leaders. Prepare to explore the React Universe with us. See you next time.